Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another episode in the series The Cross Questioned. And in this series we have been looking at the Easter story, or the Easter events as recorded in the pages of the Bible. If you have not been following the series, you will need to go and do a refresher course, because we have dealt with so much information that you would need to go back and have a look at that. If you get it out of context, maybe it won't be as easy for you to follow, but I'll try as best as I can to refer back to different points as we go along, inshallah, today. So far we have covered the entire point where Jesus was taken captive. He was crucified on the cross, allegedly, and now he has been taken down from the cross. He has been put into the grave. It's supposedly the Sunday morning now, and the people have come to look for his body in the grave, and they've come there and found that there is nothing in the grave. And so they're looking for Jesus' body, but there's nothing to be found. We looked at the one instance where it is recorded that when they got to the grave, that they saw an angel who descended from heaven, who came down in Matthew's version, and he says, "Why are you looking for Jesus? He is not here. He has been raised." So when we looked at Mark, who in his versions, he does not have a guard on duty outside the tomb. So in Mark's version, it's quite easy for someone to have just come and taken the body. In his version, he says that when they went to the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side wearing a white robe, and they were dumbfounded. And the man who was sitting, the young man who was sitting there, says, "Fear nothing, you are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look here where he was laid, at the place where you laid him. He's no longer here. But go tell the disciples and tell Peter that he is going on to Galilee before them." And they ran out of the tomb in fear and terror, it says in Mark chapter 16, verse 5 to 8. And the last verse, it says, "And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." Now, according to some of the most ancient manuscripts, this is where the gospel according to Mark comes to an end. And all the other editions are added in by a later scribe. In some versions, this has been added by later writers, later translators, and perhaps even by church fathers. But you'll find that most Bibles these days will actually have an asterisk and will let people know that this is where the verse ends, where the chapter actually ends. So in this version, nobody saw the raised or the raised again Jesus. Now, according to the Gnostics, or those who follow the Gnostic Gospels, this is how it should have been, because the Gnostics ridiculed the idea of a literal resurrection of the dead. According to the Gospel of Peter, which is one of those Gospels that has not been accepted by the Christians, it says that those who say that they will die first and then rise are in error. They must receive the resurrection while they are still alive. So this is what the Gospel of Peter says. It is not necessary to rise in the flesh, it says in the Gospel of Peter. So he's basically giving the idea from a Gnostic point of view. So they were quite happy that this was a Gnostic version. They didn't need the rest of the words that came after that. The ending was, however, not going to be acceptable to Paul and his followers. So by the time the Gospel of Mark had become prevalent and accepted in various church centers, you find that the extra chapters are added in. And so nowhere do we actually find any of the ancient or older translations where these verses are added in. So it is unknown at whose hand and at what time these other verses from verses 9 to 20 were added to chapter 16. But we know that they were never spoken or never used in the earlier manuscripts. And therefore, we have to always look at the more original documentation than looking at something that came after that. I mean, even if you are looking at a piece of literature, the literature that was written in the beginning is accepted over literature that came later if it's written by the same person, because you want to see what he originally intended. So we continue with the text and what the text actually says, because we need to have a look whether the text is reliable. And it says, when he had risen from the dead early on Sunday morning, he appeared first to Mary of Magdala, from whom he cast out 7 devils. She went and carried the news of what happened to those who were mourning and to his sorrowful followers. But when they were told that he was alive and that she had seen him, they did not believe it. Mark chapter 16, verse 9 to 11. If we did not know that this was a later edition, if we were unaware that this Mark chapter 16, verse 9 to 11 was actually not in any of the original documents, and we were naive enough to believe that it was part of the original text, and we didn't have any knowledge of it, and you're sitting at home as a Christian, and you've never went to study theology or anything like that, and you were just sitting at home and you didn't know it was a later edition, we could say that Mark was contradicting himself here, because he himself had not stated that Mary of Magdala had seen the raised Jesus. In his earlier account, she is nowhere to be seen. But the cat has let out of the bag by him saying that they did not believe it. So he is really, even with the text being written, you can see that there is a different thinking of how the story should come to an end. And so in this person's version, he writes, and they did not believe it. Did they not believe it because she was a woman and they were being sexist? Did they not believe it because there was never going to be a resurrection of the dead, according to what they understood, because they knew that Jesus had already been taken into heaven or paradise or removed from this planet? Or did they not believe it because they believed that they had already removed the body earlier that day, and therefore how can he have been raised, or whoever's body that was lying there? Now, it continues to say in Mark chapter 16, verse 12 to 13. Later, Jesus appeared in many different guises, or as some versions prefer to take it, they've changed that many, and they say, later Jesus appeared in a different guise to 2 of them as they were walking on their way in the country. Then there were those who did not recognize him. So it's interesting that in Mark's version, he says that Jesus took on a disguise, in other words. He put on a disguise, or he put on a different face, or put on a different body. We don't know. It just says, later Jesus appeared in different guise. In a different guise. In other words, not the way Jesus looked before he was crucified. Now this would give credence to the idea of somebody else actually being there and it not being Jesus himself. There also is the idea that other people that were around did not believe it even when they saw who he was, as we'll look at later. Even when they saw him and he identified himself, it says that they did not believe. But anyway, you can read this for yourself and see this text actually exists yourself in Mark chapter 16, verse 12 and 13. These 2 incidents are actually borrowed from what we find written in Luke, although he does not say that the 2 of them were walking in the countryside. But there is a definite copy from that earlier text. Matthew writing later than Mark, by which time the myth had already started to circulate about how Jesus was actually crucified and he lay in the grave for 3 days and then he raised again, had taken root and had overtaken the other stories of the day, or maybe the more accurate accounts of what happened at that fateful day when the person was crucified on that cross. And when this story or myth had already taken root, it tells us that the woman hurried away from the tomb in awe and great joy and ran to tell the disciples. In fact, the text goes on to say, and suddenly Jesus was there in their pathway. He gave them his greetings, and they came up and clasped his feet, falling prostrate before him. Then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and take word to my brothers that they are to leave for Galilee, because they will see me there. as it says in Matthew chapter 28 and verse 8 to 10. So the 11 disciples made their way to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to meet him. When they saw him, they fell prostrate before him, though some were doubtful. It says, this is all found in Matthew chapter 28, verse 16 to 20. So verse 17 says, when they saw him, they fell prostrate before him, though some were doubtful of him. Jesus then came up and spoke to them and said, full authority in heaven and on earth has been committed to me. Go, therefore, and make all nations my disciples, baptizing men everywhere in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teach them to observe all that I have commanded you. And he assured them that I will be with you always, even until the end of time. Matthew chapter 28, 16 to 20. So this is the verse that we find in Matthew. This is how Matthew's gospel comes to an end, and that is the end of it. But it makes one thing very clear, that the command to go forth into all nations was given only by the raised Jesus. Well, let's take a break, and when we get back from the break, we will continue, inshallah.
Dispel your doubts.
The Muslim brethren in India, why do they refrain from saying Vande Mataram?
Remove your misconceptions.
112 years old guy got married, 13-year-old girl, Safiya.
Discover the truth.
Your scholarship is very profound. I would like to be benefited by it.
Get articulate and absolute answers to clear your misconceptions.
If you have any questions regarding Islam and comparative religion, this is the opportunity to question.
Ask Dr. Zakir, an exclusive open question and answer session to clear your doubts and get correct information about Islam, the religion of peace, in Crossfire this Saturday at 8:30 p.m. and repeat telecast at 10 a.m. UK on Peace TV.
Say He is Allah one and only. Allah, the absolute and eternal. He begets not, nor is He begotten. There is nothing like Him.
Focus on the source of wisdom.
The Quran is a magnet, and the Sunnah is a revelation. Islam had the solution right from the beginning. We apply that, and the problem is solved.
Focus on the solution for our world.
There is no man on the face of earth. His life was narrated to us like Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Poor, rich, white, black, Arab, non-Arab, everybody say the same word. Obey Allah, obey the messenger.
Focus on the Akhirah.
Tawbah is mandatory upon each and every Muslim.
Success for the Muslim is having the correct belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Allah has power over all things.
Focus on the facts and realities that motivate the world towards Islam in Islam in Focus, next on Peace TV. The value of money in the hereafter will be measured by its proper use in the present.
يا أيها الذين آمنوا أنفقوا مما رزقناكم من قبل أن يأتي يوم لا بيع فيه ولا خلة ولا شفاعة.
According to the glorious Quran, one of the best ways to use your money is to spend it in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by spreading His message of Islam. Peace TV
is a non-profit Islamic satellite television channel that is primarily dedicated for just that cause, the proper presentation of Islam. It's a great choice to invest in it and a golden opportunity to purify your wealth in a way that pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Support Peace TV. Send your zakat and donations to IRFI Al Ryan Bank, 47 Calthorpe Road, Birmingham, UK, B151TH. Pound account number 011-32301. IBAN GB49ARAY 30008301 132301. Sort code 300083. Swift BIC code ARAY GB22. Please confirm your contribution at support@peacetv.tv.
Support Peace TV, the solution for humanity.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We are continuing with our series, The Cross Questioned. And we've looked before the break that in the Gospel of Matthew, it comes to an end with the Great Commission, with Jesus, according to the Bible version, saying, go out into all the world, making disciples of all people, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and I will be with you even until the end of time. But it makes one thing very clear in the book of Matthew, that this command of the Great Commission to go out into all nations and baptizing people was only given by the Jesus that was raised from the dead, the Jesus of antiquities, the Jesus of the development of the myth, and that of Jesus being raised from the dead. So the Jesus before he is crucified does not give this commission in Matthew, he only gives it after. And this all smacks of a later development of the myth. Historically, the disciples to whom the command to go forth was given only to preach to the Jews. So this command now given to speak to all nations smacks of a later development, of an innovation of a later time. It is Paul who proclaimed himself, remember, much later to be an apostle to the Gentiles and started preaching differently to the other apostles and disciples. If you remember from the earlier episodes that we spoke about, Paul started to fail with his ministry. He was unable to make any disciples amongst the Jews, or very, very few. And then he had a revelation that he must now be the apostle to the Gentiles, and the others must all continue doing what Jesus had told them and to preach to the Jews. So if this is the case, and that is supposed to come after the Gospels, how come in this Gospel we have Matthew telling them, you must go out and make disciples of all nations? Because that was not the command. So the raised Jesus did not say that. All the Bible writers wrote it in as a later edition. So we find that whoever this person is who's writing this book, and who's ever writing this dialogue, is obviously borrowing from Paul's writings, or what Paul had already said and was already doing. If it was supposed to predate what Paul's conversion, Paul's influence on the church, then there would be no such wording, all nations. It would have simply said, go to all the people of the lost house of Israel. So we know for a fact that this was written long after Paul's writings were already in circulation. So this is how we know that his fingerprint and DNA evidence is already all over these Gospels, and they have been corrupted. They are not in their original way of writing. But we should revert to the story of those guards on duty that were standing outside the tomb of where Jesus was supposed to be buried. It's because we just went past that. We forgot about that. So let's go back and look at those security or those military guards that were put outside the tomb of where the Prophet Isa, peace be upon him, is allegedly to have been buried, or whoever it was that was buried there. So let's look at the text again and see what the text says, because we don't want to give our own version. I want to tell you what the text says. The text says, the woman had started on their way when some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests of everything that had happened at the tomb. After meeting with the elders and confirming together, the chief priest offered the soldier a substitutional bribe and told them to say the following: say to the people if they ask you, his disciples came by night and they stole the body while we were asleep. Then they added, if it should reach the governor's ears, he will put matters right with him and see that you do not suffer for telling this lie, in other words. So they took the money and did as they were told. And the story became widely known and is currently in Jewish circles to this day. Matthew chapter 28, verse 11 to 15. So Matthew thus gets himself out of the difficult situation in which he has put himself into by this very easily. So what he does is he says, if you hear a rumor or a story that somebody came and opened the tomb and took the body that was supposed to be Jesus, then don't believe it, because somebody came and they bribed the security guards or the military guards, and the bribing went so far up the ladder that even the governor was told that we will make a deal with the governor so that nothing will happen to you. So you just keep telling people that somebody came in the middle of the night, they stole the body, and they left with the body. And that you guys were asleep, because in fact they were asleep. According to the narrative of Matthew chapter 28, verse 11 to 15, they were asleep. So Matthew manages to get himself out of the difficult situation in which he has put himself into, but not totally out of the problem. One does not have to be an investigative journalist. One does not have to work for CNN or Dateline or have to be a Sherlock Holmes to see the obvious problems in the story. If the gods said that they were asleep, how could they say that the body was stolen? If they were asleep, how do they know the body was stolen? Maybe the body just woke up and walked out. Well, could we even imagine that any soldier in the Roman army, remember these were Roman soldiers, would ever admit to being asleep on guard duty? What was the result? And we know this from history, we know this from ancient times. If you were found asleep, you were killed. There was no mercy. They would not dare to have said that they were asleep. They would have said maybe they were knocked out, they were tied up, they were attacked in the middle of the night, anything but saying that they were asleep, because they know that they would have been killed for this offense. But they did it anyway. So we know that this smacks of somebody else writing who did not have that type of knowledge at that time. They didn't have the honor of being able to look back into the history books. They were living at that time in probably another area where maybe we were not much knowledge of what Romans actually got up to, and so they didn't know this. So this story smacks of innovation. So why did they go? This is the other big, huge, million-dollar question that we have to ask ourselves. Why did they go to the high priest's house? And why did they not go to their own commander and tell him? I mean, they were not sent there by the high priest. They were sent there by the Roman commander. They were reported to the Roman commander. Never would a Roman go and give their report and fear to a high priest. He had absolutely no jurisdiction or any contact with them. Luke brings not only in one but two angels in his story. So we find as these stories develop, as these stories go along, they start to get added onto. More and more strange things begin to happen. If we read in Luke's version, he doesn't have an angel with the lightning and coming down and the rock splitting open. He doesn't have, like we have in the other version, where there's a young man sitting there and asks him, why are you looking for the dead amongst the living? Luke has his own version, and he says, they went inside and the body was not to be found. While they were standing there, all of a sudden, two men in dazzling white garments were at their side. And they were terrified and stood with their eyes cast down. And the men said to them, why are you searching for the dead while the one who you're looking for is alive? According to some versions, it says, he is not here, he has been raised. And these two men that are standing there that appeared with these dazzling white clothes on say, remember when we told you while he was still here that you must go to Galilee and that you will see what he told you about the Son of Man, how he must be given up into the powers of sinful men and be crucified and must rise again on the third day. Then they recalled his words, and returning from the tomb, they reported all this to the 11 and all the others. This is found in Luke chapter 24, verse 2 to 9. Now Luke finally lifts the curtain of the names of the woman who saw all this. He says the women were Mary of Magdala, Jonah, and Mary the mother of James, and they, with other women, told the apostles. But the story appears to be nonsense, because when they came and gave the story to the disciples, Luke chapter 24 verse 11 says, they did not believe them. So in Luke chapter 24 verse 10 and 11 it says, but the story appeared to them to be nonsense, and they did not believe him. Even those disciples, even the woman, they didn't believe any of them. Now it's worth remembering that the apostles did not believe the story even after the angels had reminded the woman of what Jesus himself had told them earlier. This is in spite of raising doubt. Whatever Jesus had indeed prophesied about his being raised after 3 days, or whether this was a later thought that was added in by other people. So we have a huge amount of doubt whether this was actually what Jesus had indeed prophesied, or it was something that was written at a later stage. If he had indeed prophesied it, they would have been excited and would have gone out. If he didn't prophesy and was later an addition by somebody else saying he will raise in 3 days, then they would have not believed it. These are doubtful entries, and we cannot accept them as authentic. It is also interesting that there are doubtful entries on various versions and different accounts, where some of them will say the mother of James in various versions, and others will state the wife of James, and even others say the daughter of James. So we see that in some versions it's the mother, some it's the wife, and some it's the daughter. So we have to ask ourselves, can you believe it when we don't even know who the mother was of? So many different versions that we need to look at, and each version that you look at we will see are different. Some of them accept a verse as authentic, some of them omit it and say that the verse is not authentic. Like we see in verse 12 in the King James Version, they say that it is not authentic and omit it and replace it with a little marking, say that it is of doubtful nature. They have the truth to actually say this is of a doubtful nature. And so their version is different. Next time, inshallah, we'll be going over that again. We'll be having a look at a little bit more in detail. I'm having a look at some of the things that happened after what happened at the gravesite. We're going to look into that as well. Is there any truth in it? Well, we've run out of time, so if you want to hear more, if you want to know more about the cross question, join us next time. So from me, Areeb Islam, until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.